Lucero watched the grandfather clock behind Celine's desk as they and Toyol discussed paperwork, eyes following the pendulum as it moved back and forth with every second that passed. He glanced around the office he found himself in, the candle burning on the desk, the altar with the statue of the moon goddess in the corner, the pristine white sofa he sat on. Everything was too tidy for anyone to feel comfortable in there, and as Lucero shifted awkwardly in his spot, he internally begged for their meeting to be over. Celine seemed to notice his discomfort, putting a graceful signature along the bottom of the paper. Again, I apologize for calling you both in on such short notice. We did try to resolve this issue on our own, but with the full moon festival happening tomorrow, we had no other choice. They looked up from their paper, seeming to almost make a point to look at Toyol rather than Lucero, congratulating him for keeping his composure. Toyol sat across from Lucero with his back straight, hands folded in his lap, nodding politely as Celine spoke. Of course, no worries. The festivals are important. I wouldn't want anything getting in the way of them. Celine handed the paperwork over to him, pointing out where to sign. Still... Celine glanced between Toyol and Lucero, as if sizing them up. Lucero sat up a bit straighter in response. I don't want to give your Defa too much work. Are you sure you can handle this? Oh, certainly. Lucero responded immediately, glancing at the clock again before putting his own signature down on the document. This is all we need to sign? Celine nodded, standing up and pulling a duffel bag out from under her desk. She reached inside, pulling out a small box. Holes were poked so that whatever was inside could breathe, and an anxious rustling could be heard as it scurried around. Chains held the box closed. They handed the box slowly over to Toyol, as if it were a bomb. Here it is. She reached into the bag again and pulled out a set of keys, dropping them into Lucero's hand. I would suggest running a few lab tests on it before even considering releasing it. Put it to sleep with some anesthetic, take a blood sample, and make sure it isn't anomalous before taking off any of the safety measures we put inside the box. Celine thought for a moment before looking up at Toyol, that same look as before as they sized him up. Your Defa's doctor is qualified to do lab tests, correct? Lucero felt his eye twitch. He is, otherwise we wouldn't be calling him a doctor. Toyol shot him a look before nodding. He is qualified, yes. He isn't a vet, though, so I'll admit I'm a bit unsure what you mean. Oh, this isn't an animal. You'll need a doctor, not a vet for this. Toyol stared at her, waiting for her to elaborate. I have to admit, I'm very impressed with what your Defa has done recently, Celine continued. Dropping the professionalism, I was a bit worried when your Defa started contributing to the country again. I thought you were going to collapse after a week, but it seems like you're staying afloat. Thank you, Celine, I appreciate it. But everything's okay with your Defa? I know you just signed the paperwork, but if your Defa's too busy, I'm sure we can find someone else to handle this. Akale's Defa might... I appreciate the concern, Celine, but really, we can handle this. I know all the other rebels are worried about us, but we have everything under control. Celine nodded in approval, a small smile on their lips. That's good to hear. You're a good leader, Rebel Singh. I'll see you at the monthly meeting. You as well, Full Vasquez. They added quickly, shaking Toyol's hand before walking the two to the door. They walked down the staircase of the grand palace of Celine's Defa. A beautiful crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling. A Greek-style marble statue of their Banim leader, Lady Luna, stood proudly in the center of the foyer. Hundreds of people bustled back and forth, grabbing food from the mess hall or doing work around the palace. Lucero caught a glimpse through the door of the ballroom and saw a group of dancers practicing inside, preparing for the upcoming moon festival. Lucero poked a finger into Toyol's side. Tori, he mumbled. Toyol swatted away his hand. Lucero poked him again. Toyol elbowed him in the side, and Lucero got the message. They would talk when they were back home. They walked out into the back garden, coming to the Ricala lake that would send them back to their own Defa. The crocodile-like Ricala guarding the lake was clearly over-pampered and overfed, to the point where Lucero wondered if it was still even serving its purpose as a protector of the lake. Its tail wagged like a dog as its handler fed it a scrap of meat, before beckoning the two to step forward. Lucero showed them his ID card, and they were let through. They waded into the lake until the water just barely passed over their heads, before emerging on the other side in the middle of a forest. Their Defa's Ricala, Lollipop, wagged her tail as they emerged, and Lucero was quick to feed her a scrap of food, patting her on the head before looking back over at Toyol. Toyol had put the box down on the ground, dropping his professional act and lying down on the grass face down. We have everything under control, he mumbled into the dirt. Yup. We had nothing to do last week, Lucero pointed out. Lollipop tried to bite him, and he backed away quickly, tossing another scrap of food to her. Like, actually nothing. I know. Their Defa has like 1,000 people. How many do we have? We have like 20 adults. Half of them don't even live here, bro. Why are they giving this to us? The full moon festival's coming up. Their Defa's whole thing is the moon. They can't shave 2 people off of their committee. Their Defa's like 20 times bigger than ours and they can't take 2 people off of their festival planning committee. Toyol groaned in response, sitting back up and pulling out his phone. Okay, what do we have? Let's just figure this out. How many commissions do you have left? I gotta finish up 2 more knives and 2 prosthetic fingers, but they're all halfway done. The shipping truck comes at 8 tonight. Will you make it? Lucero checked the time. It was 3:30. If I work from now until then with no breaks. Toyol nodded. We'll need someone to watch the werewolves tonight. Are we putting them in the Weliona rooms again? Lucero shook his head. Akuma's in there for another day, remember? Toyol cursed under his breath. Right. Akuma's release ceremony's tomorrow. Well, where are we putting them? I talked to Rico earlier. We're gonna put him and Eddie in one of my testing chambers. Can those testing chambers hold them? I built them to withstand a nuke, man. They can hold 2 werewolves for a night. Then once Akuma's out of the Weliona rooms, we'll transfer him there for the rest of the week. Toyol glanced up from his phone in the direction of the Defa. Walking towards them was his partner Basil, their AAC device held in one hand and a tablet in the other. They stared at the box on the ground for a long moment, seeing it shake slightly as whatever was inside ran around. They held up their hand to sign what for a moment, before stopping and tapping on their AAC. Meeting. Toyol muttered a curse, standing up and wiping the grass stains off his pants before picking the box up. He shoved it unceremoniously into Lucero's hands. Lucero fought himself to not throw it at his head. Don't do this to me, man. I have a meeting with Fothalesha, okay? Me and Basil will be back in about 2 hours. Just hand this over to Jack. He's never busy around this time anyway. He can get the lab tests done, then he can be in charge of figuring out what this is until I'm back. Sound good? No, Lucero responded immediately. Basil handed the tablet over to him, giving him a pat on the back as if wishing him luck. They made the sign for bad, then jabbed their thumb in the direction of the Defa. What's bad over there? Lucero yelled back at them, but they had already walked into the lake, with Toyol following close behind. Lucero was left alone with the Ricala trying to take a bite out of his ankle, and a chained-up box with an unknown creature inside scraping at the sides of its enclosure, the sound similar to nails on a chalkboard. Lucero took a moment to ponder what circumstances in his life led him to this, before turning around and heading to the Defa. Luna's Defa, with their extravagant palace and beautiful statues, was almost a complete opposite to the Defa Lucero called home. From Banim's Defa was built underground, not completely unlike a bunker. Luna's Defa had over 1,000 people, while they only had a little over 60, with only a third being over the age of 18, and exactly 0 over the age of 22. The Defa was run by the cooperative effort of 10 people in their late teens and early 20s, trying their best to raise 40 children, and every second Lucero spent there felt like they were one mistake away from everything falling apart. Lucero turned the tablet on as he walked through the forest. The tablet connected to their security system, allowing him to quickly swipe through their cameras, searching for Jack and assessing the damage that came from a bunch of children who just got out of school, who were currently entirely unsupervised save for one 19-year-old stoner. The entrance opened up and he walked down the stairs into the Defa. To his left was the mess hall, where 10 kids were attempting to create what Lucero could only assume was a parkour course. The 19-year-old in question was sitting in the corner of the room, working on a commission that he would be shipping out that night. Lucero caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up. He gave a thumbs up back and Lucero moved on. They'd have to clean up later, but as long as someone was making sure the kids wouldn't get hurt, that was good enough for him. Most of the other kids were either in their rooms or playing video games in the rec rooms, so Lucero figured they'd be fine unsupervised for a bit. He checked the cameras, finding Jack in the training room. The teenagers were being taught hand-to-hand combat, and it seemed like their trainer Sean had roped Jack into helping him. Lucero ran over his very short mental list of who would be able to replace Jack without messing with their training, flipping through the cameras to find all of the other adults. Sean and Jack were training the teens, Bing and Ping was watching the kids in the mess hall, Basil and Toriel were in a meeting, and Brooklyn, Pong, and Kosuke were working in the daycare, taking care of an extra 30 toddlers that did not live here, but were part of their Defa's responsibility to Banim society. Lucero knew that Lang would be back from work in an hour, and Toby would have just clocked out and would be heading home though, so he took that and ran with it. Lucero knocked on the door of the daycare, opening it without waiting for a signal and assessing the damage before saying anything. Considering that most of the toddlers they babysat had supernatural powers, things seemed to be going pretty well. One 2-year-old was climbing around on the ceiling, and another was spinning their head around in circles like an owl and giggling to themselves. One had managed to summon all of the ants that lived in the building and had them follow her around like she was the Pied Piper. So everything was going about as normally as it usually went. Kosuke was reading to a group of kids while Brooklyn and Pung started laying them down for a nap, whispering to each other about what they were going to do about the ants once the kid fell asleep. Lucero caught Pung's eye and got him to follow him out of the room. "Are you here to save me?" Pung asked hopefully. "Gods, no. Can you replace Jack in the training room, though?" "And have Sean kill me in front of an audience of teenagers? No, thanks." Brooklyn put another kid to bed and walked over. "Lucero, we need Pung here. We legally can't have less than 3 adults watching the kids. Well, there's like 20 kids downstairs and 0 adults watching them, so I think it'll be fine." Brooklyn glared at him. "Plus," Lucero added awkwardly, "Toby's gonna be home soon, so it'll just be you and Kosuke for like 15 minutes at most." Lucero lightly shook the box in his hand, causing the creature inside to scrape and knock at the walls even more. "Come on, this is important. What the fuck are you holding?" Brooklyn reached out, placing a hand on the top of the box. The creature inside seemed to slam against the sides even harder. Luna's Defa found it in one of those abandoned labs. Said it needed to be studied and dealt with quick. Brooklyn hummed. The toddler crawling on the ceiling fell, and Kosuke screamed and leapt over 2 kids to catch them. The toddler threw up on his shirt to thank him. Pung grabbed a spare shirt from the closet and tossed it to him. "You two can manage, right?" Brooklyn sighed before turning around and putting a smile on for the kids, taking the toddler from Kosuke and putting them to bed. "If Toby's late, I'm killing him myself." "Cool." Lucero grabbed Pung by the arm and pulled him out, closing the door before Brooklyn could change her mind. Pung and Lucero went down the elevator to the second-to-last floor, walking down the hallway to the training room. On their right as they passed were the rec rooms, where 20 kids no older than 13 had dispersed to watch TV and play video games. Lucero knocked on a couple doors to remind the kids to keep them open while they were unsupervised, and while 2 or 3 complained, they all did as he asked with little hesitation, so he took that as a win. They reached the training room at the end of the hallway, and Pung quickly swapped out with Jack. Lucero explained everything to Jack as they took the elevator down to the bottom floor, reaching the infirmary. "I'm only trained to take blood samples from humanoids, not animals." "It's not an animal." Jack stared at Lucero, and he could feel the confusion behind Jack's mask. "Yeah, I don't know what it is." "Did Fosling not explain?" "She might have, but I wasn't listening." Jack sighed, washing his hands and putting on gloves. "A blood sample will take 2 or 3 hours to process, but I will likely be distracted. Some of the kids may be injured during hand-to-hand combat, and Tori's gonna be back in 2 hours, so once the lab results are in, you can just pass this back to him." "Excellent." Lucero placed the box on one of the hospital beds, handing the keys over to Jack. Before Lucero could even ask, Jack said, "Go work on your commissions. I can take care of this on my own." Lucero nodded and stepped out, making his way down the hall to his workshop. He scanned his ID card and unlocked the door, being greeted by a 13-year-old draped across his workbench, his head hanging upside down over the edge. "What are you, a cat now, Benji?" Benji's head shot up and he fell off the workbench with a loud thump onto the stone floor. "It's about time you got back," Benji whined, rubbing his back as he stood up. "What took you so long?" Lucero pulled up his next order on his tablet, pulling out the half-finished knife from a cabinet and lighting a fire in his forge. "How'd you even get in here? I locked the door." "I phased through it." "Sure you did." "I did. I didn't even know I could do that. I just leaned against the door and fell through. But then I couldn't figure out how to phase back out, so I've kinda just been stuck in here for an hour." Lucero hummed, only half listening as he stoked the flames. "Anyway, can I have my 3DS back? When you raise that F in your math class to a D, then we'll talk." Benji mumbled an insult that Lucero chose to pretend not to hear. As Lucero began hammering out the blade to his knife, Benji sat on the floor a few feet away and watched. A few minutes passed with nothing but the hammering of metal to break the silence. Lucero eventually grew tired of the staring, taking a pair of safety glasses and gloves and tossing them to Benji. "You ever thought about being a blacksmith, Benjamin?" Benji struggled to catch the glasses and gloves, knitting his brows together as he looked up at him. "No? What's this for?" "You can either leave or I'm gonna put you to work." Benji stood up, hesitantly putting on the glasses and taking off his thin, fingerless gloves to replace them with thick leather work gloves. "This is child labor?" "No, this is a learning opportunity. Always good to learn about the trades." "Will I be credited for helping make this?" "That's not how this works, kid." Lucero pushed a bucket towards Benji with his foot. "There's some quench oil in the cabinet. Go fill this bucket up." Benji took a moment to pout, expressing an annoyance that didn't seem to meet his eyes, before turning around and marching to the cabinet. Hours passed, and 8 p.m. eventually rolled around. Benji had left after an hour of work, and Lucero had gone largely uninterrupted after that. As Lucero taped closed his final order and slapped a shipping address onto the box, Toriel came knocking on the workshop door. The two brought the boxes up the elevator on a dolly and out to the Rakala Lake, where two Sakala-pulled carts waited. Bing and Ping and Pung had already loaded up their own commissions of beautifully designed masks, dresses, skirts, and artwork. Lucero threw his boxes onto a cart, Toriel spoke to the drivers, and soon enough they were heading back inside for dinner. After a brief period of cutting up food and pouring drinks for the kids, Lucero sat with Toriel, Basil, and Jack. "So what was in the box?" he asked. Toriel wrinkled his nose and grimaced. Basil tapped on their AAC. "Hand." "What?" "Yes, hand." A kid ran up to Jack holding a juice box, and he opened it without even looking.
"Your hand, to be specific,"
he spoke plainly.
"It was a perfect match. This does mean that this is an anomaly, though."
Lucero didn't really want to process what that meant. He shoved a spoonful of food into his mouth to avoid having to speak. Jack continued as if he hadn't noticed.
"I tried to put it to sleep with gas before opening the box, but since it is just a hand, I couldn't. I opened the box and it jumped out and crawled around the infirmary like a spider. I had to tie it down in order to take a blood..."
"Hang on, so when you say it's my hand," Lucero blurted out, "do you mean my hand, or do you mean it just looks like my hand, or..." A kid ran by their table and tripped, spilling a cup of soda on the ground and beginning to cry, looking up at Toriel with big, watery eyes. Toriel picked the kid up and dusted them off, before grabbing some napkins and beginning to wipe up the spill. "It's an exact match, biologically and appearance-wise," he said from the ground. "If we're assuming it's a half-formed anomaly, that means someone was trying to create a version of you." "Or happened naturally. Happens sometimes," Basil said, going on to spam a few buttons on their AAC as they thought. "Would be weird for someone to want to create copy of you. Makes sense to be natural."
"We will only really be able to know after we check the lab Defa found it in."
Lucero felt a tap on his shoulder, turning around to see one of the werewolf brothers, Rico, standing behind him, his arm twitching every few seconds as he tapped the tips of his fingers together awkwardly, a pained grimace on his face. Mr. Lucero? Time to go?" Rico nodded. A few feet away, his brother Eduardo had managed to corral their entire friend group. 8 teenagers, one of their 9-year-old sisters, and another one's 4-year-old sister. Lucero remembered that they would be staying in his workshop, watching over the two of them, and ran over all of the things he would need to teenager-proof before he could get back to his already cold dinner. He stood up with a huff, stretching his arms over his head, and trying not to think about how his huff sounded vaguely like his abuelo's, and his thought process felt like his mother's. "If she could only see me now," he thought wistfully to himself. "She would never let me hear the end of it." With that thought, Lucero excused himself from the table and led the kids downstairs, hoping that they would make it before Rico and Eddie tried to eat them. Jack and Lucero had decided to head out to the lab that night. As soon as they had put the last kids to bed, they grabbed some flashlights, filled their bags with medical supplies and emergency gear, and headed out to the Rakala Lake. The lake took them to the middle of a dark jungle, about a mile away from the lab. Fireflies drifted past as firebirds flitted between the trees, acting as stars under the thick canopy of leaves. Even at the dead of night, the jungles of Banim always felt peaceful, and it was easy for Lucero to lower his guard as they trudged through. The two focused their flashlights on the ground, watching for exposed roots and rocks as they cut through branches with a machete whenever needed. The moss on the trees glowed a pale light blue, lighting their way through the jungle. The lab they were going to was west of the mountain range, meaning it wasn't in Vercey's territory. If Lucero was still a newcomer to Banim, he likely would have assumed they were losing territory to their enemy. But by now, he had come to realize something. A surprisingly small amount of their everyday issues had to do with Vercey. A surprisingly large amount had to do with people who decided to fuck off into the woods and try and live separate from society. Abandoned laboratories, factories, and campsites littered the area just west of the mountain range and around the Great Bay. Scientists and doctors who wanted to do illegal experiments made up a surprisingly large portion of the people found in them. 1 or 2 of the kids they took care of at Lucero's Defa were people they found in those labs. One 17-year-old was used as a supposed pathway to immortality, and was injected with something that looked concerningly similar to a zombie virus. In the rubble of an abandoned factory, they had found a robot with a human heart and lungs, whose engine oil smelled like blood. Lucero wouldn't be surprised if someone had decided to try and clone him. He was sort of a politician, solely based on the fact that nearly no one else in his Defa is legally old enough to be one of their representatives. It wasn't like he was a complete nobody, so the possibility was there. Lucero kept this in mind as they reached the edge of the jungle, shining his flashlight up to the abandoned laboratory. It had been overtaken by nature already. glowing blue moss illuminating the entrance. It clearly hadn't been raided, the windows were still intact and the door was closed. The people who stayed there had simply left.
Do you think they relocated?
Jack asked, walking up to the door and hesitating as the automatic doors slid open, responding to his presence as if the building were unaware it was abandoned. They might have. Maybe they heard that Luna's Defa found them and moved out. Cracks ran through the stone walls of the laboratory. It looked like the building had been abandoned for months, but as Lucero noticed that every light bulb still seemed to be working, he had trouble believing that. Jack and Lucero checked every room, but aside from some beakers half filled with unknown chemicals and the occasional report crumpled up under a desk, they found nothing that indicated this lab had ever even been used. They had found a report with a date from a week ago at the top, so at least they knew how recent the evacuation was. Cleaned up pretty good, didn't they? Lucero said as they moved on to the basement level. Jack responded with a hum, shining his flashlight down the hallway, even though the ceiling lights illuminated the way perfectly fine. As they walked down the hallway, Lucero started to smell cheese, and he wondered if he was getting bored enough to be delusional. Jack continued to the very end of the hallway without stopping, coming to a set of doors leading to what looked like an operating room. He opened the door a crack before tensing up, his head pointed down to the ground. Lucero tried to peer over his shoulder, but considering the guy was almost a foot taller than him, that proved to be difficult. Jack turned to glance back at Lucero.
Can you smell that?
Are you smelling Parmesan too? Could also be old milk or vomit, I guess. Kinda weird, right? Jack stared at him as if he'd just told him the sky was green.
That's butyric acid. Dead bodies produce it during butyric fermentation.
As Lucero felt his stomach twist into a knot, Jack pushed into the room, not waiting for Lucero to follow him as the doors closed behind him. Lucero groaned and braced himself, pushing through the doors, the smell of cheesy death acid permeating his senses. Aren't dead things supposed to smell like rot? He faltered for a moment, staring across at the corner of the operating room. Half of a dried-out corpse was laid down on its stomach on the mold-covered floor. Beetles and larvae crawled along the skin and exposed ligaments. Its arm was outstretched towards the operating table, and its hand was missing.
They don't really smell like rot if there's nothing left to decompose. This has been here for at least a month.
Jack pulled a box of blue plastic gloves out of his backpack, pulling on a pair and delicately examining the corpse's outstretched arm.
Their hand was removed surgically. This is definitely the body the hand we got belongs to.
The cross necklace Lucero got from his great-grandfather felt ice-cold against his chest as he saw it dangling from the corpse's neck, caked in dirt, blood, and mold. Didn't you say the hand we got was mine? Jack didn't respond to that, and Lucero didn't want him to. Lucero forced himself to look away and tried to ignore it. Who the corpse used to be was nearly unrecognizable at this point, and Lucero preferred it that way. The two left soon after. They had been able to put together some of the pieces. They had only found half of the corpse's body, and it seemed to be fused into the floor by the spine, about an inch below the ribcage. Jack believed it had appeared there through a natural anomaly, and had simply gotten stuck. The scientists found it, and decided to use it for their experiments, with one involving the hand they had now. Lucero didn't want to think about it too much. Anomalies as a whole were still a very unknown thing as far as he was aware. No one knew how conscious they were when they were created, and it was too rare of an occurrence to be properly studied. After a few minutes of Jack explaining his theory, he noticed Lucero's silence and fell silent himself, only their footsteps and the occasional crow of a firebird being heard as they went back to the Ricala Lake and back home. Lucero followed Jack down to the infirmary to check on the hand. Jack had tied it by its fingers to the bottom of the box, but even after removing its constraints, it barely even twitched. Jack believed it was dying, and Lucero didn't have any reason to argue. He simply left and went to check on his workshop. The werewolf brothers were curled up together, asleep in the testing chamber. Their friends had brought sleeping bags and made themselves comfortable wherever they could. Two of the vampires, Lachlan and Michaela, were sitting in front of the window looking into the testing chamber, playing a very aggressive game of Go Fish, where they would stop playing every other minute to argue through loud whispers at each other. Their little sister Dawn was lying in a bright pink sleeping bag next to them, not even pretending to sleep as she watched them argue. Lucero grabbed some blankets from his closet and draped them over the two vampires' heads, telling them to get some sleep before they passed out. Lachlan opened his mouth to argue, but then Lucero poked Michaela's crush awake to take the next shift, and Michaela punched and swatted at Lachlan until he went silent. Once the kids had settled down to sleep, Lucero headed back out. He checked the control room, finding Toriel and Basil still awake, and letting them know he and Jack were back before heading upstairs. He went up to one of their rec rooms and collapsed onto the couch, wrapping a blanket around himself and flicking on the TV just to fill the silence. He fidgeted with his great-grandfather's necklace absentmindedly, trying to focus on what was happening on the screen while also trying to fall asleep. The credits rolled on one episode of the TV show, then another, and then another. There was a knock on the rec room door, and someone opened it before he could say anything. Toriel sat at his feet on the couch, dressed down to a tank top and sweatpants and looking like he hadn't slept in a month. Knowing him, that was probably accurate. Basil came and sat on a beanbag in the corner, and Jack sat on the couch next to Lucero.
It is a bit hard to tell for sure, but I believe the hand is dead.
Jack spoke bluntly. Lucero nodded, his eyes trained onto the TV screen. Toriel cleared his throat. Are you doing okay after all that? I'd rather not think about it, man. Toriel nodded, opting to stare at the TV screen with him as credits rolled on another episode. After a minute of silence, Basil snapped to get their attention. I found a new bird documentary. Do you want to watch? I was saving it for movie night, but we can watch now. Basil, I would kill a man to learn about some toucans right now. It's not about toucans, it's about the rhinoceros hornbill. It's Malaysia's national bird. I've never heard of that bird in my life. Pull up the documentary. How long is it? It's an hour and 28 minutes.
Is it just about the rhinoceros hornbill?
Jack asked. Basil simply nodded, smiling as if it's exactly what they want in a documentary. Knowing them, it probably was. The four of them curled up together on the couches. It reminded Lucero a bit of when they were teenagers, before the kids had started joining the Defa, and before they had been given the responsibilities they had. He thought about the kids in his workshop, and how that was how he and the other adults used to sleep sometimes, sprawled across a room wherever they could just to be able to sleep together. As Basil had planned, the documentary put everyone to sleep by the time it ended, and since none of them had stayed awake through the whole thing, they were able to show it again on movie night.